The sky over the Persian Gulf was a deep, bruised purple as the sun dipped below the horizon on a humid Tuesday evening. For the pilots of Viper 1 and Viper 2, two U.S. F-35 Lightning II fighters patrolling the northern borders of Kuwait, it was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance flight. They were flying at 30,000 feet, their advanced sensors scanning the desert landscape for any signs of movement across the border. But in a split second, the silence of the cockpit was shattered by the rhythmic, high-pitched scream of the radar warning receiver. Viper 1, Spike, Northern Sector, AAA and SAM activity detected. The wingman's voice crackled over the encrypted radio. Far below, hidden among the dunes of the northern frontier, an Iranian-made Hordad-15 mobile missile battery had been waiting in silence. Without warning, the desert floor erupted. A long, blinding streak of orange flame tore through the darkness, followed by the thunderous roar of a solid-fuel rocket engine. The missile, a THAAD-3, clawed into the sky, its heat-seeking eye locked onto the thermal signature of the multi-million-dollar warplanes. In the cockpit of Viper 1, the pilot's world became a blur of high-G maneuvers. He punched out a cloud of magnesium flares, hoping to decoy the incoming threat. Braking right, he grunted, his body pressed into his seat by the crushing force of the turn. For a moment, it seemed the flares had worked, but the Iranian missile, guided by advanced radar tracking, ignored the heat and made a final, violent correction. A massive explosion lit up the Kuwaiti sky. The shockwave rattled the windows of high-rises in Kuwait City miles away. Viper 1 was gone, transformed into a tumbling ball of jagged metal and burning fuel. Seconds later, a second explosion confirmed that Viper 2 had suffered the same fate. On the ground, at the Ali al-Salem air base, the radar screens went blank. The room fell to a deafening silence before erupting into a frenzy of shouted orders. Lost contact, 2 birds down, search and rescue, launch immediately. The smoke over Kuwait began to drift south, a dark, oily shroud hanging over the desert. This wasn't just a technical failure or a border skirmish. The wreckage falling into the sands near the Raudatane oil fields was the physical proof that a red line had been crossed. As the sun disappeared completely, leaving only the glowing embers of the downed planes, the world began to realize that the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East had just shifted. The smoke wasn't just from burning jet fuel. It was the signal fire for a conflict that threatened to pull the entire world into the abyss. In the aftermath of the disaster, a haunting question echoed through the halls of the Pentagon and the command centers of CENTCOM. How? Kuwait was supposed to be protected by the most sophisticated umbrella of technology ever devised. Between the Patriot PAC-3 batteries, the hovering presence of Aegis-class destroyers in the Gulf, and the near-omniscient eye of overhead satellites, the northern border was considered a no-go zone for hostile projectiles. Yet as the wreckage of 2 F-35 smoldered in the desert, the reality was undeniable. This was the missile shield failure. At the heart of the failure was a brutal lesson in the evolution of asymmetrical warfare. For decades, Western military doctrine assumed that Iranian technology was merely a crude imitation of Soviet-era designs. But the strike over Kuwait revealed a terrifying leap in capability. Iranian engineers had perfected a saturation and deception tactic. Intelligence analysts soon realized that the Hordad-15 system hadn't acted alone. It was part of a coordinated electronic offensive that temporarily blinded regional radar arrays. Moments before the launch, a swarm of low-cost, radar-reflecting drones had been released along the border. To the Patriot missile operators, the screens suddenly filled with hundreds of ghost targets, a digital blizzard that forced the AI-driven systems to recalculate. While the computers struggled to prioritize the threats, the actual lethal missiles were launched at a low, sea-skimming trajectory, hugging the terrain of the desert floor to avoid detection until the very last second. But the failure wasn't just technical, it was a failure of imagination. The U.S. had built a shield designed to stop ballistic missiles arcing through the atmosphere. They were less prepared for hybrid missiles, projectiles that could switch between radar guidance and infrared mid-flight. When the F-35s deployed their electronic countermeasures, the Iranian missiles simply switched to passive mode, homing in on the very jamming signals the American jets were using to protect themselves. The shield didn't just fail, it was used against the pilots. In the command bunkers at Camp Arifjan, officers stared at the playback logs in disbelief. The world's most expensive defense grid had been bypassed by a combination of clever engineering and ruthless tactical patience. The realization was chilling. The technological gap that had protected U.S. interests in the Middle East for 30 years had closed. The missile shield failure sent a clear message to the world. High-tech supremacy was no longer a guarantee of safety. As emergency crews worked to recover the flight recorders, the global military community watched in silence. The umbrella had broken, and for the first time in a generation, the American eagle found itself exposed under a sky it no longer fully controlled.
Inside the windowless Situation Room of the White House, the air was thick with a tension that felt almost physical. On the large center screen, a high-resolution satellite feed showed the smoldering scar in the Kuwaiti desert where Viper 1 had impacted. It was 3 a.m. in Washington, but no one was tired. Adrenaline had long since replaced the need for sleep. This was the moment of the red phone, diplomacy on the brink. The president sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of State. The question wasn't if the U.S. could retaliate. The carrier strike groups were already repositioning in the North Arabian Sea, but whether retaliation would trigger a chain reaction that no one could stop. For the first time since the Cold War, the specter of a global conflict was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was a live scenario. Because the United States and Iran have no formal diplomatic ties, the red phone wasn't a direct line to Tehran. Instead, it was a frantic, multi-layered scramble through Swiss intermediaries and the Sultanate of Oman. In Muscat, diplomats were pulled from their beds to relay a flash message from the State Department. The tone was chillingly blunt. Identify the perpetrators and stand down immediately, or face the full weight of the United States military. The response from Tehran arrived 90 minutes later, and it was not the apology Washington expected. Through the Swiss channel, the Iranian Supreme National Security Council issued a defiant counter-warning. They claimed the American jets had violated sovereign airspace and that any strike on Iranian soil would result in the immediate closure of the Strait of Hormuz and a rain of fire on every U.S. base in the region. In the United Nations, the corridors of the Security Council were a hive of panicked whispers. The Russian and Chinese ambassadors were already calling for maximum restraint, but intelligence reports suggested that Russian satellite data might have assisted the Iranian missile lock. The diplomatic chessboard was expanding. If the U.S. struck Iran, would Russia move on Eastern Europe? Would China move on the Pacific? The dominoes were lined up, trembling. Back in the Situation Room, the Secretary of Defense placed a set of folders on the table. They were the target packages for Iranian radar sites and missile factories. The window for a proportional response is closing, Mr. President. If we don't act, we lose deterrence. If we do, we might start World War III. The red phone was humming with the weight of the world's survival. In those silent pauses between messages, the fate of millions hung on the ego and the restraint of leaders thousands of miles apart. Diplomacy was no longer about finding common ground. It was about finding a way to let both sides back away from the cliff without losing face. As the clock ticked toward dawn, the world held its breath, waiting to see if the next phone call would bring a temporary peace or the first orders of a global catastrophe.
Within minutes of the confirmation that American jets had been downed by Iranian missiles, the shock waves traveled faster than any military jet. This was no longer a regional skirmish. It was the first tip of a global domino. This was the global domino effect. The first casualty was the global economy. In Tokyo, London, and New York, the opening bells of the stock markets were met with a sea of red. But it was the oil ticker that told the true story. Brent crude surged by $20 in a single hour. Traders, fearing the immediate closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the jugular vein of the world's energy supply, began to panic. Every tanker currently in the Persian Gulf became a potential target, and insurance companies immediately canceled coverage for the region. The cost of shipping everything from grain to microchips skyrocketed, signaling a global inflationary spike that threatened to tip the world into a sudden deep depression. But the economic chaos was merely a symptom of a much deeper geopolitical realignment. In Moscow, the Kremlin saw an opportunity. As American carrier groups moved toward the Gulf, Russian forces along the borders of Eastern Europe were put on high alert. Intelligence reports suggested that Russia was feeding Iran real-time GPS jamming data to further complicate U.S. naval movements. The logic was cold and calculated. The more the United States was bled in the Middle East, the less it could defend its interests in Europe. In the East, the second domino fell. Beijing issued a stern warning against external interference in regional affairs, but behind the scenes, the Chinese Navy began maneuvers in the South China Sea. China, heavily reliant on Iranian oil, saw the U.S. buildup as a direct threat to its energy security. The no-limits partnership between Russia, China, and Iran was no longer a diplomatic phrase. It was becoming a military reality. The world was witnessing the birth of a multi-front conflict, a nightmare scenario where the U.S. would be forced to fight or at least deter three major powers simultaneously. Across the globe, ordinary citizens felt the tremor. In Europe, governments began discussing energy rationing. In Washington, the political divide vanished overnight, replaced by a grim realization that the post-Cold War era was officially dead. The global domino effect proved that in the 21st century, there is no such thing as an isolated incident. A missile fired from a desert dune in Kuwait had the power to turn out the lights in a factory in Germany and trigger a naval standoff in the Pacific. As the dominoes continued to fall, the question changed from will there be a war to can anyone stop the chain reaction? The world was interconnected by trade, data, and alliances, and now those very connections were pulling every nation toward the center of a gathering storm. The clock on the wall of the Pentagon's National Military Command Center flickered to 0400 hours. For the President of the United States and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the time for debate had passed. Every diplomatic channel had returned a cold, defiant echo. Every economic indicator had plummeted. Now only the hard, steel-cold reality of military force remained. This was option zero, retaliation or total war. In front of the President lay a leather-bound folder containing the proportional response options. It looked simple on paper, strike the specific missile batteries in southern Iran that fired on the F-35s, destroy their radar hubs, send a message. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff shook his head. "Mr. President," he began, his voice raspy from lack of sleep, "there is no such thing as a proportional strike anymore. The moment our tomahawks cross their coastline, we are no longer in a skirmish. We are in a regional firestorm." The military intelligence was clear. Iran had moved its mobile launchers into civilian areas and buried its command centers deep beneath granite mountains. A small strike would do nothing to stop the next wave of missiles. To truly eliminate the threat, the U.S. would have to launch a massive, multi-carrier air campaign, a Day Zero strike. This would mean hitting hundreds of targets simultaneously, from drone factories in Isfahan to naval bases in Bandar Abbas. If we go with option 0, the National Security Advisor warned, we have to be prepared for the fallout. Iran will retaliate by mining the Strait of Hormuz. Their proxies in Iraq and Syria will swarm our outposts, and we have to assume Russia and China won't stay on the sidelines. The president looked at the digital display. 3 U.S. carriers were now in position, their decks crowded with FA-18s and F-35s, fueled and armed. B-2 Spirit bombers were already in the air, flying halfway across the world, waiting for the final authentication code. The world was seconds away from a conflict that would dwarf anything seen in this century. Option 0 was the point of no return. It was the choice between accepting a humiliating blow to American prestige or stepping into a dark tunnel where the end might be a nuclear exchange. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every person at the table knew that their decision would be read about in history books, if there was anyone left to write them. Retaliation was a military necessity. Total war was a global catastrophe. The president picked up the secure handset. The silence in the room was absolute. The order given in the next 10 seconds would determine if the sun would rise over a world at peace or a world beginning the first day of its final war.